In a bustling urban setting where tensions between law enforcement and marginalized communities simmer beneath the surface, the story unfolds against the backdrop of a city grappling with deep-rooted racial divides. The streets are patrolled by officers who, whether consciously or unconsciously, carry their biases into their work. It is in this environment that we meet Officer Daniel Crowley, a seasoned cop with a reputation for being tough but, more troublingly, for making questionable decisions when it comes to minorities. His approach to law enforcement is rigid, his views shaped by years of seeing the worst in people, and he often misinterprets confidence or assertiveness from people of color as a challenge to his authority. Enter Agent Maya Thompson, a highly competent and respected black female FBI agent. Maya is a woman who has worked tirelessly to rise through the ranks, proving herself in a profession where she is often one of the few people of color in the room. She is intelligent, confident, and fully aware of the biases she faces daily, but she carries herself with dignity and professionalism. The story's initial conflict is set in motion when Crowley, unaware of her position, stops Maya for a minor traffic violation. Instead of a routine interaction, the situation quickly escalates when Crowley's implicit prejudices surface. He humiliates her, using demeaning language, and ultimately arrests her, ignoring her attempts to calmly explain her identity and position. The narrative hook lies in the aftermath of this encounter, as Crowley soon discovers the true identity of the woman he has wronged, setting in motion a series of events that will challenge his worldview and force him to confront the consequences of his actions. A black female FBI agent is driving home after a long day at work, still dressed in her professional attire, when she notices flashing lights in her rearview mirror. She pulls over, confused, as she hasn't violated any traffic laws. A white police officer, who has a reputation for being harsh and discriminatory, approaches her car with an aggressive demeanor. He immediately assumes she's a criminal based solely on her appearance and the car she's driving. Without any clear reason, he asks her to step out of the vehicle, accusing her of suspicious behavior. The agent remains calm, knowing her rights, but the officer's tone becomes increasingly hostile as he starts questioning her about where she's going, what she's doing in this neighborhood, and even the legitimacy of her car. Despite her efforts to explain that she's an FBI agent, the officer dismisses her claims. He demands to see her ID, but even after she shows him her badge, he accuses her of carrying a fake and tells her that she could be impersonating a federal officer. The agent is stunned but keeps her composure, knowing that this situation could escalate if she reacts emotionally. She calmly insists that her credentials are legitimate, but the officer, fueled by his own biases, refuses to listen. He radios for backup, determined to arrest her despite having no legal grounds to do so. As he places her in handcuffs, he begins to humiliate her further by making derogatory comments about her race and gender, all while other officers arrive and watch the situation unfold without intervening. At this point, the situation has drawn the attention of bystanders, some of whom begin recording the incident on their phones. The agent is now sitting on the curb, handcuffed and humiliated, while the officer continues to belittle her. Just as the officer prepares to take her to the station, a senior FBI agent arrives at the scene, having been alerted by someone who recognized the situation for what it was, a gross abuse of power. The senior agent immediately demands that the officer release her, revealing that not only is she an FBI agent, but she's also one of the top agents in her division. The officer's face turns pale as he realizes the gravity of his mistake. His arrogance and racism have led him to arrest someone far above his own rank, and now he has to face the consequences of his actions. The tables turn quickly. The FBI agent, now freed from the handcuffs, stands up and calmly explains the seriousness of the officer's misconduct. The senior agent informs the police officer that his actions will be reported, and an internal investigation will be launched. The officer, who had been so confident in his authority just moments before, is now visibly shaken. He tries to justify his actions, but it's clear that there's no excusing what he's done. The FBI agent walks away, her dignity intact, while the officer is left to grapple with the fallout of his actions. Karma hits him hard when he realizes that his career could be in jeopardy, not only because of his blatant racism but also because he underestimated someone based on their appearance, never bothering to consider the possibility that she could be far more powerful and respected than he ever imagined. The aftermath of the incident spreads quickly, thanks to the videos taken by bystanders. The officer becomes the subject of public scrutiny, and the police department is forced to address the situation. The FBI agent, though humiliated by the experience, gains even more respect from her colleagues and the public for how she handled the situation with grace and professionalism. Meanwhile, the officer faces disciplinary action, and his reputation is tarnished, proving that his discriminatory behavior has real consequences. He learns the hard way that racism and abuse of power will not go unchecked, especially when directed at someone who has dedicated their life to upholding the law. The cop, emboldened by his authority, escalates his humiliation of the agent, unaware that hidden cameras have captured everything. As he smugly processes her arrest, his supervisor arrives, revealing the agent's identity and classified mission. The cop's career and reputation begin to unravel instantly. The city streets were quiet that evening, the kind of quiet that often signals an impending storm. Officer Bradley, a man whose reputation preceded him, had never been known for his restraint. His colleagues turned a blind eye to his behavior, dismissing his racial biases as mere rough edges. He had always believed his badge gave him the authority to act however he saw fit, and the system had done little to correct that belief. Tonight, however, he would find himself on a path where his past actions would finally come to bear down on him. It all started when he saw her, a black woman sitting in her car, minding her business. She wasn't breaking any laws, wasn't doing anything suspicious, but Bradley's instincts, tainted by his prejudices, told him otherwise. Without hesitation, he approached her car, rapping on the window with a force that made her flinch. The woman, calm but clearly irritated, rolled down the window and asked, "Is there a problem, officer?" Bradley's eyes narrowed. Something about the way she spoke to him, calm, composed, and unafraid, set him on edge. He demanded to see her ID, and when she asked why, his response was immediate and harsh: "You fit the description." She raised an eyebrow, but complied, handing over her ID without further argument. As he glanced at the identification, the name seemed familiar, but he couldn't place it. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered, his voice cold and commanding. The woman, clearly accustomed to situations like this, stepped out, but not before locking her car and putting her phone in her pocket. Bradley's eyes followed her every move, his mind already racing with assumptions. He had no idea that the woman standing before him was an FBI agent, one who had worked on cases far more dangerous than anything he had ever handled. As the encounter escalated, Bradley became more aggressive. He accused her of resisting, of being uncooperative, and before long, he had her in handcuffs, humiliating her in front of the few onlookers who had gathered. She remained calm, her eyes betraying none of the anger or fear she might have felt. Inside, however, she was calculating, observing his every move, every word, knowing that karma had a way of catching up to people like him. She had seen it before in her line of work, and tonight, it was only a matter of time. Once he had her in custody, Bradley began to realize something was off. The woman wasn't acting like the usual suspects he dealt with, and her ID, there was something about it that gnawed at him. He called it in, expecting validation of his authority, but the response he received was far from what he anticipated. A moment later, his superior's voice came through the radio, asking for clarification. "You arrested who?" The tone in the voice was not one of support, but disbelief. Bradley's stomach dropped. The woman standing before him was Special Agent Rachel Brooks, an FBI agent with a stellar record. She wasn't just any civilian, she was someone with far more power and influence than he could ever imagine. The weight of the situation began to settle in. His arrogance had blinded him to the reality of his actions, and now he was facing the consequences. Agent Brooks, still in handcuffs, remained silent, watching him as the realization dawned on his face. Bradley's mind raced, trying to think of a way out of the mess he had created. He had humiliated her, insulted her, and now there was no way to undo what he had done. The tension in the air was palpable, and for the first time in his career, he felt truly vulnerable. Bradley's fellow officers arrived at the scene, and it didn't take long for them to understand the gravity of the situation. One of them, Officer Martinez, who had always had a more level-headed approach, immediately recognized Agent Brooks and moved to de-escalate the situation. "Bradley, what the hell were you thinking?" Martinez whispered harshly as he unlocked the cuffs from Brooks' wrists. Bradley stood there, speechless, as the agent rubbed her wrists and looked directly at him. There was no anger in her eyes, only disappointment. "You should have thought this through," she said quietly, her voice steady. The next few days were a whirlwind of internal investigations and media coverage. Bradley's name was dragged through the mud, and for the first time in his career, he couldn't hide behind his badge. The department, eager to distance itself from the scandal, placed him on immediate suspension pending further investigation. His fellow officers, once indifferent to his behavior, now avoided him, knowing that his actions had jeopardized not only his career but also the reputation of the entire force. Agent Brooks, on the other hand, remained professional throughout the ordeal. She didn't need to seek revenge. Bradley's downfall was inevitable. The system that had once protected him now turned its back, and he was left to face the consequences of his actions alone. The public outcry was swift, with calls for accountability and reform echoing throughout the city. Bradley had always believed he was untouchable, but now he was learning the hard way that karma doesn't forget. As the days turned into weeks, Bradley found himself reflecting on the choices he had made throughout his career. He had built his authority on intimidation and prejudice, never stopping to consider the impact of his actions. Now, stripped of his badge and facing potential criminal charges, he had no choice but to confront the reality of who he had become. In the end, it wasn't just his career that had been destroyed, it was the very foundation of his identity. And as for Agent Brooks, she continued her work, undeterred by the events of that night. She had seen men like Bradley before, and she knew she would see them again. But this time, Justice had been served, and the lesson was clear: no one is above the law. The tension in the small police precinct had reached its peak. Officer Rick Sanders, a middle-aged cop with a history of questionable conduct, had just arrogantly thrown Agent Maya Brooks, a black female FBI agent, into a holding cell. He had humiliated her during a routine traffic stop, refusing to believe her credentials and assuming she was a criminal. Despite her calm explanations and attempts to de-escalate the situation, his deep-seated biases took over, leading to her wrongful arrest. Sanders felt untouchable, confident that his position in the system would protect him, as it had many times before. However, as the hours passed, the reality of his actions began to unravel. Unbeknownst to him, Maya had already been in communication with her team before the arrest, and they were en route to the station. When FBI agents, led by Maya's superior, Agent Williams, stormed into the precinct, the atmosphere shifted dramatically. Sanders, who had been smugly filling out paperwork, was taken aback by the sudden appearance of federal agents. His superior, Captain Reynolds, immediately knew something was wrong when Agent Williams presented a formal complaint and demanded Maya's immediate release. The confrontation between Sanders and the FBI agents was swift and sharp. Williams didn't mince words, informing the precinct that Sanders had violated federal protocol by detaining a federal agent without just cause. As Maya was freed from the holding cell, her calm demeanor only highlighted the gravity of Sanders' mistake. She stood tall, her professionalism intact, despite the indignity she had endured. Sanders, on the other hand, began to stammer, realizing the gravity of his actions. The FBI team made it clear that this wasn't just an internal matter. Sanders had committed a serious offense that would result in both legal and professional consequences. In the following days, Sanders found himself under intense scrutiny. His past conduct was reviewed, and it became evident that this wasn't the first time he had overstepped his bounds, especially with people of color. The precinct, now under investigation by both the FBI and Internal Affairs, distanced itself from him. Captain Reynolds, though initially hesitant to reprimand Sanders, was forced to cooperate fully with the investigations, realizing that protecting a rogue officer would only bring more trouble to the department. Sanders, once confident in his untouchability, now faced suspension, with the likelihood of being stripped of his badge altogether. Maya, meanwhile, continued her work with the FBI, but the incident left an indelible mark. She had faced countless challenges in her career, but this experience reminded her of the deeply ingrained biases that still pervaded law enforcement. However, she refused to let it define her. The resolution of the case didn't just serve as personal vindication, it also opened up larger conversations within the FBI and local law enforcement about racial profiling and the treatment of black professionals in the field. For Maya, justice wasn't just about Sanders facing consequences, but about pushing for systemic changes that would prevent such incidents from happening in the future. As the dust settled, Sanders was ultimately dismissed from the force. The legal system, which he had once thought would protect him, had instead held him accountable for his actions. The irony of his downfall wasn't lost on him. He had spent his career believing that his position of power granted him immunity, but in the end, it was that very power he had abused that led to his undoing. For Maya, the journey continued. She remained steadfast in her commitment to justice, knowing that the fight against prejudice and discrimination was far from over. The incident had been a painful reminder of the work that still needed to be done, but it also reinforced her belief in the importance of standing up, not just for herself, but for all those who had been wronged by the system. The scene starts with a routine traffic stop, but it quickly escalates due to the racial biases of the cop involved. A black woman is driving her car when she's pulled over by a white police officer, who immediately assumes the worst based on her skin color. His demeanor is aggressive and demeaning from the very beginning, as he approaches her vehicle with an air of superiority. Without asking for her identification, the officer begins to accuse her of suspicious activity, refusing to listen to her explanations or give her a chance to speak. As the situation worsens, the woman calmly tries to explain that she's an FBI agent, showing her badge as proof of her identity. But the cop, blinded by his prejudice, refuses to believe her. He humiliates her further, forcefully pulling her out of the car and handcuffing her in front of bystanders. The woman's professionalism and calm demeanor stand in stark contrast to the officer's aggressive behavior, but despite her efforts to de-escalate the situation, the cop continues to treat her with hostility and disrespect. The cop's arrogance peaks as he smugly calls for backup, confident that he's about to make a major arrest. However, when his colleagues arrive on the scene, they immediately recognize the woman as a high-ranking FBI agent. The look on the cop's face changes from smug satisfaction to utter disbelief. In an instant, his world is turned upside down. The tables have turned, and it's clear that he has made a massive mistake. His colleagues reprimand him for his actions, and he's forced to remove the handcuffs from the woman he had wrongfully arrested. The once confident and arrogant officer now stands in shock, realizing that his prejudice and assumptions have led him to humiliate someone far more powerful and respected than he could have imagined. The FBI agent, still composed despite the ordeal, accepts his apology but makes it clear that his behavior was unacceptable. She speaks calmly but firmly, reminding him that his role as a police officer is to protect and serve all citizens, regardless of their race or background. The lesson is clear: his actions were driven by his own biases, and those biases have no place in law enforcement. As the officer stands there, embarrassed and regretful, he knows that his career and reputation have been irreparably damaged. Karma has indeed come back to haunt him. The incident serves as a powerful reminder of the dangers of racial profiling and the importance of treating everyone with respect and fairness. The FBI agent's composed response throughout the ordeal highlights the strength and resilience required to overcome such challenges, while the cop's downfall shows the consequences of allowing prejudice to dictate actions. The story not only reflects the ongoing issues of racism within law enforcement, but also serves as a testament to the fact that justice, in one way or another, will always prevail. In the aftermath, the officer faces disciplinary action for his misconduct. His colleagues, who initially respected him, now see him in a different light, and he's left to reflect on how his unchecked biases have led to his downfall. Meanwhile, the FBI agent continues her work, knowing that she has set an example not only for those around her but for anyone who faces discrimination. Her strength and grace under pressure prove that dignity and professionalism can triumph even in the face of ignorance and bigotry. This story invites us to reflect on the broader issues of racial bias and systemic injustice. It's a call to action for everyone to examine their own prejudices and to challenge the biases that exist within society. Law enforcement officers, in particular, must be held to the highest standards, as their actions have the power to impact lives in profound ways. The cop in this story learned his lesson the hard way, but the hope is that others can learn from his mistakes and work towards a more just and equitable society. As we conclude, it's crucial to remember that accountability is key. We must hold those in positions of power responsible for their actions, and we must continue to strive for a world where justice is blind to color and where everyone is treated with the dignity they deserve. If this story resonates with you, share it, start a conversation, and let's work together to create a future where equality is more than just an ideal, it's a reality.